The wind, like a heavenly shepherd, drove the gloomy clouds across the sky, and the air smelled of rain. In the courtyard, on an inconspicuous bench by the flower bed, a young girl sat on the bench, covered her eyes with her hands, and cried quietly. It seemed that the approaching rain did not frighten her at all, and she was so immersed in her suffering that she did not notice anything around her. The first heavy drops of rain had already fallen on the asphalt, making it clear that in a minute or two a downpour would break out. Residents from the surrounding apartment buildings were hurrying to get home as soon as possible, so as not to be caught unawares by the weather. Nobody paid attention to the lonely girl crying, and only the janitor Klavdia Nikitikna could not pass by. "Hey, honey, why are you crying? It's going to start raining at any hour, and you're sitting in the open air. What's happened?" Touching the sleeve of the stranger, the kind-hearted woman asked. "It happened, Auntie." Through tears, the girl squeezed out, timidly looking at the janitor. "Well, tears can't help the grief, especially now it will start raining. Let's go to my back room. There you will tell everything," said Klavdia Nikitikna, and led the crying girl to the basement, where she had a room for storing equipment. Having closed the door behind her, the janitors, first of all, put the kettle on the electric stove and sat the guest on an old armchair in the corner. At the same moment, there was a real downpour with a thunderstorm and zigzags of lightning cutting through the sky. In the meantime, the change of scenery was good for the girl, who stopped crying and looked at Klavdia Nikitikna with gratitude. "Well, dear, tell me what happened and who hurt you?" asked the woman, pouring the guest a cup of hot tea. Sighing heavily, the girl sniffed her nose and began her story. As it turned out, the stranger's name was Dasha, and she came from far away, from godforsaken Tega village. Daria was an orphan and had recently buried her grandfather, the only person she had ever known. In search of a better life, the girl went to the city, where she got a job as a storekeeper at the food base. Having worked for a month, the girl was looking forward to her paycheck, but as it turned out, clever employers deceived the provincial orphan, hanging a huge shortage on her. Thus, dishonest businessmen wanted, with the help of outstanding debts, to force the unfortunate girl to work for them for free. Forcibly escaped from this trap, Dasha left wherever she went, and now did not know what to do next. Klavdia Nikitikna, without a word, patiently listened to the guest, only occasionally shaking her head in indignation at the human meanness. Then, coughing, she said, "Yes, it happens, my dear, but nothing, maybe I'll be good for you. My daughter works in an agency. They recruit staff for hotels and houses of wealthy people. Everything is fair and without deceit. In general, if there is a desire to work, and everything else will come. So, shall I put in a good word for you?" Dasha's eyes shone when she heard about such a good offer for herself. "Of course, I agree, Aunt Clav. I have a lot of desire, especially you have to live for something. All right then. Tonight you'll spend the night at my place, and tomorrow you'll go for a job interview. In your position, this is a favorable option, Dashenka," answered Klavdia Nikitikna, smiling encouragingly at the guest. That day, they chatted until late in the evening, feeling a growing mutual sympathy for each other. Aunt Clava, as promised, called her daughter and described the situation to her. The next morning, Dasha was already given the address of the house in which she was soon to work as a maid. The house was located in an elite cottage area, where one building was more beautiful than another. At first, it seemed to Dasha that she got to some fairy tale city, where kings and queens lived in beautiful castles. But when she found the address she needed, she was simply stunned by everything she saw. The mansion of her future masters was so large that it stood out even against the palaces of the other wealthy citizens of the village. The owners of the house, Adelina Vasilievna and her son German Viktorovich, received Dasha cordially. The requirements they put forward were quite acceptable, so the employees and the employers were generally satisfied with each other. But especially Dasha liked Herman, who from the first day of acquaintance began to give her all sorts of signs of attention, literally undressing her with his eyes. Daria did not understand the look of the young master, because at that moment the house was preparing for the wedding, and judging by Adelina Vasilievna, the bride was from a very rich and influential family. And why did you need me, orphan, beggar, thought Dasha, embarrassed by the greasy looks of Herman. The girl did not know that her master's passion was girls, whose hearts he broke with shocking regularity. Adelina Vasilievna, on the antics of her son, looked through her fingers, believing that a man at a young age needs to communicate with the opposite sex to gain experience. About Herman, Dasha behaved with emphasized coldness and politeness, trying not to stand out and not to attract attention. But unfortunately, her appearance did not give the young master peace of mind, and one evening in despair, he decided to go to the extreme. Dasha had just finished her chores and was going to go to bed in the maid's cottage. But Herman, who had spotted the maid in the kitchen, took her by the hand and literally dragged her with him into one of the many guest rooms. The young impudent man was drunk and could no longer restrain his desires. "Herman Viktorovich, what are you doing? What do you want from me? I'm going to scream now," Dasha timidly objected. "Scream as much as you like. Scream, and tomorrow you'll find yourself on the street. And also, I'll write such a review to the agency that you are not only a maid, even a cleaner in the barracks will no longer be hired," said Herman without a bit of embarrassment. No matter how hard Dasha tried to resist the insolent master, still she did not succeed. The girl liked her work and Herman was very convincing. The girl cried, on her knees begged, but the rich son did not lag until he achieved his own. "Why, Herman Viktorovich? After all, you are getting married," through tears asked Dasha when everything happened. "Of course, I'm not getting married. What are you thinking? So what of it? Work and keep quiet. And I'll give you a bonus," replied the major, taking a breath. Dasha was so nasty at heart that she wanted to quit her job and go wherever she wanted. "But where would I go? Who needs me, a penniless orphan? And I can't let Claudia Nikitikna's daughter down. She vouched for me when I was hired without work experience and references," Daria thought, smearing bitter tears on her face. Having decided that the meeting with Herman would be limited to one time, the girl stayed and endured the offense. It should be said that after all that had happened, the master behaved as if nothing had happened, looking at the maid appraisingly. They say that time heals, and Dasha has no choice, so the girl prefers to forget about this incident, crossing out this unpleasant episode from her memory. And soon, to think about the events of that unfortunate night, there was no time, because the wedding day was approaching and even the always imperturbable Herman felt inner anxiety about it. The wedding ceremony and the 3 days of celebrations that followed were carried out with great fanfare and were even covered by reporters from many local newspapers. After Herman's wedding, Dasha breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that now everything was over and the owner would no longer care about her. In part, it turned out to be so. Herman, pretending to be a loving husband to his powerful wife, did not even look in her direction. But Dasha did not have long to rejoice on this occasion. One morning, she once more felt sick and nauseous, which had been accompanying her for several days. Trying to chase away anxious thoughts, Dasha took a pregnancy test, the results of which shocked her so much that for a moment, she was speechless. "God, I'm pregnant. What do I do now? Shame on her. What will people think? She got pregnant by a rich man for money. A good maid, I can't say," Daria thought, crying and pressing her face into the pillow. Not knowing what to do next, Dasha told everything to Herman, whose guilt for what had happened was undeniable. "You've got to be kidding. Wow news, especially after the wedding. Are you trying to ruin my life?" "All right, don't cry, dummy. It's good that you came to me right away. I'll call a doctor I know and get you an abortion," said Herman, having recovered from the initial shock. "It's a sin, Herman Viktorovich. How can you do that?" Dasha tried to object, but the major waved away and would not even listen to anything more. When the master left, the girl covered her face with her hands and sobbed loudly, mentally complaining to herself about the unfair life. But no matter how much Daria wanted to keep the child, on the appointed day, she was already standing in front of the door of the clinic, where, after some time, was to terminate her pregnancy. The girl twice tried to overcome her embarrassment and fear and stepped over the threshold of the medical institution, but every time she was held back by something. And on the third time, she turned around and slumped her head and wandered away. Raised by her grandfather in Christian traditions, Dasha could not commit such an atrocity and take the life of her unborn child. Remembering her promise to her master, the girl took out of her purse a telephone and called the rich major. "Herman Viktorovich, I'm sorry. Do what you want. I couldn't," sobbing, said Dasha. "Yes, business. She couldn't. You women only spread your legs and know how. And when the matter comes to payback, so all in the bushes." "Okay, wait for me to come," irritably muttered Herman and hung up the phone. Dasha was waiting for him, sitting on a bench, not far from the clinic. Herman arrived about 20 minutes later and handed her the keys to the rented apartment and a bag of groceries. "Okay, here you go. You're not working as a maid anymore. The belly will soon be visible and everything will be clear. Stay in your apartment and don't go outside. You'll give birth, and then we'll figure it out." Dasha, blushing to the roots of her hair, timidly took the keys and groceries. "Well, that's right. Don't look for me. I'll find you myself." The major said goodbye and, getting into the car, drove away in an unknown direction. Dasha was disgusted and disgusting at heart, but there was no other way out. A girl who grew up without parents could not even imagine that she could take the life of a child. That's why she preferred shame and future condemnation to sin. "Nothing. I will give birth, and then I will go to my place in the middle of nowhere and raise a son or daughter," thought Dasha, trying to find an excuse for herself. Time passed, and during the whole period of pregnancy, Herman, as promised, visited the former maid, bringing food and everything necessary. Of course, his visit seemed to Dasha a worthless handout, which the major tried to make up for his guilt. Her son's frequent absences aroused the suspicions of Adelina Vasilievna, who decided to ask him directly. Of course, the woman expected to hear anything but this. "Herman, are you a brainless cretin? Christine's father will destroy you. Understand, we are fleas against him. There, so much money and connections are involved that we are not even close. So while there's still time, take care of the girl. You're the one who messed up, so learn to clean up after yourself. Next time you'll think 100 times before throwing yourself on the first maid you see." Adelina Vasilievna threw in her heart and, slamming the door, went to her study. Meanwhile, Herman, with his hands around his head, began to think painfully what to do next. "All right, let her give birth, and then we'll see. Anyway, she is now in the maternity hospital under observation," thought Herman, rejoicing at such a sensible decision. It seemed to the major that the situation was under control, and when a couple of days later, he received a call from a happy Dasha to inform him about the birth of twins, he already knew what he should do. The babies were born healthy, strong Butuzemi and Daria. To her joy, long kept in the hospital did not become, after a week, sent to discharge. There was no limit to the young mother's happiness when she moved into the rented apartment, holding Nastenka and Kiryusha in her arms. Of course, in the eyes of Herman, she did not see much joy, but during the pregnancy, Dasha was so accustomed to his sorrowful expression that she preferred not to pay any attention to him. But as it turned out, Dasha was deeply mistaken, underestimating Herman's cunning. One evening, he came over joyfully, holding a cake. Acting as a caring father, he put Kiryusha and Nastenka to bed, and then sat down in the kitchen to drink tea with Dasha. But the girl had no time to drink half a cup, as suddenly experienced severe weakness and dizziness. Losing consciousness, she managed to notice how Herman hid some tiny vial in his pocket. Dasha woke up a few hours later in a place unknown to her. Her head ached terribly and her eyes were double. Gathering her thoughts in a heap, the girl realized that she was riding in the back seat of a car unfamiliar to her. "Where am I going? Where am I?" Dasha asked in a weak voice. "Quiet, you bitch. Look, you're awake. Don't move, we'll be there soon." Someone sitting in the front passenger seat of the car growled to her. Hearing this, Dasha fell into oblivion again and woke up in some hut, very similar to the dwelling of a forester or a gamekeeper. Dasha realized it by the simple camping utensils and a lot of all kinds of herbs drying over the stove. Her late grandfather Trofim Petrovich's lodge was like this one, only bigger. Dasha's hands were tied with rope and her mouth was covered with tape. Listening to the conversation behind the wall, Daria could barely make out scraps of phrases. "Pity her, maybe we won't drown her," said one of her captors. "But we were paid, Fedia. She gave birth to twins to some rich man, and they decided to get rid of her," his partner answered in a nasty falsetto. Shocked by such news, Dasha looked around, trying to find a way out of the situation. Suddenly, her gaze stopped on the window, behind the glass of which the forest was visible. Realizing that it was her only chance to escape, Dasha carefully turned the latch and opened the window. Most likely, her captors had not envisioned such an option, thinking that a girl from the city did not know how to open clever bolts in village houses. But Dasha grew up in the village and from childhood was taught by her grandfather Trofim all the forest wisdom. Therefore, when the kidnappers entered the hut, deciding in the end to drown her, the brave girl was already gone. Dasha ran, wading through the thickets of juniper and wolfberry. Of course, it was more difficult to move with bound hands, but not having time to run a kilometer, Dasha came across a young bearded man with a dog on the forest path. Dasha shrieked in surprise and pressed her back against the trunk of the tree. "Don't be afraid, Trezor won't bite. It's a hunting breed, not a fighting breed," said the man quietly, adjusting his cap with the visor cracked from time. "Help me, please. There are bandits there. They kidnapped me and wanted to kill me. It's all because of my poor children," Dasha begged, holding out her bound hands to the guy in a protective uniform. The stranger, who turned out to be a local gamekeeper, quickly freed the fugitive from her restraints, and then, without further ado, took a walkie-talkie out of his pocket and contacted the district police. Having outlined the situation, he gave the approximate coordinates of the criminal's location. To Dasha's surprise, the local law enforcers worked quickly, and soon a search helicopter was circling over the forest. "Let's go to the gatehouse. I'll give you tea. You're not yourself. My sister has just come to visit me. I thought not to go on a round today, but Trezor insisted. He probably felt that we would meet you," smiled, said the huntsman, and patted the dog on the withers. Dasha, feeling sympathy for this big and strong guy, followed him. In the huntsman's hut, it turned out to be bright and cozy. "Oh, Andriush, and who is it with you? Is it your fiancé?" asked the girl standing on the threshold. At first glance, guessed the urban upbringing and sassiness of the inhabitants of the metropolis. "No, it's a girl. Here, she got into trouble, and I helped. You pour tea first, and then ask questions," the guy replied embarrassedly. Over a cup of fragrant tea with linden soothed, Dasha told her story from beginning to end, as it was, without secrecy and innuendo. All this time, the huntsman's sister Polina listened attentively to the girl's story, occasionally making some notes with a pencil in a small notebook. Answering the mute question in Dasha's eyes, Polina smiled and took out of her pocket a journalist's ID card from a regional newspaper. "I came to my brother's place in the middle of nowhere to cover poaching and local corruption. But your story will be much more important, so be sure. I will not leave it like this, and everyone will know about this case," said the journalist confidently. "Well, what a bastard, the rich man. He decided to get rid of the mother of his children. I would have carried her in my arms, but he sees what he's up to," said Andrei with anger, who deep down, Dasha liked her very much. Soon, on the radio, Huntsman called the district police officer and reported that the kidnappers had already been detained and gave evidence. Well, soon and to Major this turn will come. And if not, Polenka with the article will help. She is known in all publishing houses. "And for the sake of such a hot material, we'll do anything," said Andrew, trying to calm the excited Dasha. It should be said that the young gamekeeper was right. Polina's article was published 2 days later and caused a real sensation not only among the public, but also among the highest echelons of power and law enforcement. Thanks to the testimony of the detained kidnappers and Dasha's story, Herman was taken into custody. Because of the wide publicity, the investigation was held at a rapid pace, and soon the rich major was convicted, on which he will have to spend several years in prison. Kiryusha and Nastenka, Dasha took away from the rented apartment, rejoicing that Herman did not have time to do the children any harm. Adelina Vasilievna, burning with shame, offered the former maid her help, but Daria refused. The girl decided to leave the city, which turned out to be so unkind to her, and settled in the village, together with the gamekeeper Andrew. The guy had a difficult past and under his belt has already had experience of tragic relationships when his wife and daughter died in a car accident. Therefore, having learned about the trouble that happened to Dasha and her children, Andrew gladly accepted them in his house, inherited from his parents. Of course, in the beginning, Andrew and Daria lived under the same roof as friends. But over time, as it often happens in life, buddy relations grew into something more, instilled in their hearts love and feelings. Sister Polina, who knows how to understand people, approves of her brother's choice and happily plays with her nephews, whom she now has 2 at once. Smiling enigmatically, Dasha and Andrew hinted that this is not the limit, and they are thinking about a 3rd child, which will undoubtedly add a portion of happiness to their strong family life.